Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited to be here. So, our organization, Environmental Health Trust, has been working on the issue of environmental causes of cancer and other health effects for over a decade now. And there's a lot to say on this. I would start out by saying, please go and watch the last few years of presentations as well, because I'm trying to add some new things. Also, Dr. Deborah Davis's book, Disconnect, has just been updated and re-released. I wrote a chapter in here. It's a 50-page chapter, and it's all about a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, which is how you can protect yourself from cell phones, wireless, 5G, cell towers, what you can do in order to be healthier and also to make a difference. Because just like with food and water and all of these environmental health issues that we are facing that challenge our healthy living, we can make personal changes, but in the end, what's actually needed is change at the federal level. Sometimes states can take actions, but in the case of wireless and cell phones and 5G, we really need to have all hands on deck. And if everyone did something, we could really fix this situation that we're in. So let me share my screen right now and share a few slides with you. So I'm going to be talking about wireless radiation. For those of you who are new to this, all wireless devices emit microwave radiation. I did not know this. I thought my phone was magic. I mean, I just thought it just worked. I didn't realize that it was actually emitting frequencies invisible into the air. You can't smell it, you can't taste it, but it's very much there. And it's microwave frequencies, just like what comes out of your microwave oven, except it's a little bit different. First of all, microwaves heat food. And cell phones are not supposed to be so high. They're much lower level of power, so they don't overheat. However, also, wireless technology uses these frequencies to transmit data. So it's non-heating, but it's pulsed, modulated. It's an erratic signal. And there's actually a complex waveform, which several scientists have published on how it is more biologically active because of the modulation, because of the pulses. So in fact, it's different than a microwave oven, lower power, but a different kind of signal, which has been implicated in a lot of bioeffects. When we hold devices near our body, like in this picture, typical these days, shocking to me, but you have a device which is radiating right into the abdomen, right into the chest. And even pets are affected, right? Our animals, and I'm going to talk about wildlife a little bit later. We put cell phones in our pocket, unaware that that phone is always transmitting. Every wireless device, even if you're not using it, so long as it's powered on and connected to a Wi-Fi network, or even if you are not using the Wi-Fi or the cellular, if the antennas are active, it's always transmitting, radiating out radio frequency radiation, also known as RF, which is absorbed into the body. And it goes out into the air, of course. But a percentage is absorbed into your hand, into your chest, into your body. And also there are other devices like these speakers that we all have. And in fact, they are always emitting also. Now, before I go any further, because sometimes when I talk about this, people get this sinking feeling in their stomach. Some people challenge it, and I'm glad to have those conversations because that's what I did. That's how I got involved in this, is I thought, this can't be. It can't be possible. 10 years ago, when more than 10 years ago, became involved, there were not these Alexas, they just didn't exist. It was just the phone and just the towers, really, or at least that's what I thought at the time. But there is safer ways to make technology. We can fix this. I'm not against technology. I and the scientists and the experts I work with, we use technology all the time, but we use it with a wire rather than wireless. And this Alexa speaker is a perfect example because you see that cord there? That's the electrical cord. There's no reason why there couldn't be a cord that's transmitting the data instead of having it be emitting wireless and actually receiving wireless signals, because that Alexa is both receiving and emitting signals. And in the air, when that's happening, it's being absorbed into our bodies. And as far as I know, and I'm pretty sure, there have not been studies by the federal government looking at what are those exposures into the body from that particular situation, and where you have a child so close. And I say that because actually that device has a fine print warning saying it should be 8 inches away from you to be compliant with our government limits for human exposure, which are completely outdated, irrelevant to health, and don't consider children our long-term exposure. And I'll be talking about that as well. Then we have the situation of cell towers and cell antennas. They're going up on our schools, near our homes. Here's a high school with antennas on the old chimney, not in use anymore. There are many, many examples of this, and many communities and school boards that are saying no to cell towers near schools or on school property for many reasons, not just the radiation, although that's a big one, but also fire risk, the hazardous materials that are stored, and the fact that schools should be for education, not for radiation or commercial entities. So when you start thinking about this, we are now surrounded by wireless devices. And the first thing I tell people who ask, what can I do about my overexposure to wireless? The first thing is to think about what in your home emits wireless. Because one by one, you can go through those devices and start to swap out for safer technology. You also can get rid of them if you don't need them, or something that some people do to reduce but not eliminate their exposure is to just have it on and off switch. Why have it on all the time? So we have smart TVs, we have these wireless headphones, the cell phone, wireless speakers, cell towers that are outside that create exposures inside, in yards, in playgrounds, in parks, and they go through the window. You have a cordless phone and its base station, the smart light bulbs, laptops, mouse, wireless router, tablets. The MP3 players aren't really around so much anymore, but many people have them. Then you have all your wearables like smartwatches and virtual reality and wireless keyboards, anything with a Bluetooth, your wireless printer. And don't forget, I talked about this, but really important is that cordless home phone that especially many of us over 40 have. And I know I was in shock when I got a meter. There's actually meters that you can get to measure your radiation, the exposure in the air. And I had gotten rid of most of the wireless devices in my home. But I didn't realize that home cordless phone sitting right in front of me at my desk was actually emitting all the time. The base is emitting all the time. And then, of course, there are these AirPods and these earbuds that people put in their ears that also are transmitting all the time, even when you're not using them. So some kids are walking around, for hours a day, and that's right near your brain. The level might be lower, but that does not mean safe. And in fact, there are some studies that have shown effects at window times where there's a lower level rather than a higher level. And that's a whole bucket of information. You can go to Environmental Health Trust to learn more about that and to super dive into the science if you're interested. And of course, everything Bluetooth now and Wi-Fi. So You're going to hear that wireless radiation, are often called RF for radio frequency. You might also hear the term, I should say, EMF, or for electromagnetic fields. It's non-ionizing. It is not the same as your X-rays, the atomic bomb, radioactive radiation. However, and that's because it doesn't carry enough energy to immediately liberate electrons from atoms or molecules. That's called ionization. Although non-ionizing radiation and low frequency fields, which are from electrical systems, do not directly ionize, they can lead to DNA damage, and that has been shown in several studies where DNA damage, genetic damage has been found. And just to give you, so actually I should show you talk about the spectrum here. It's often divided, as I said, into non-ionizing and ionizing, and visible light is the dividing line, is about the dividing line around UV, actually. Some UV frequencies are non-ionizing and some are ionizing. And in fact, when you think about tanning beds or the studies that have been done now on these gel manicures, non-ionizing radiation is associated with cancer and with genetic damage. There is a growing and ever-growing scientific base of published studies, experimental, in people, in animals, cell cultures, that link wireless frequencies, wireless exposure to cell phones, to a broad range of impacts. Remember, our whole bodies are being exposed, so there's not just going to be one part of your body. There's studies associating people who use the cell phones for years to their head with with heavy use, which was defined as over 30 minutes a day, to increased brain cancer. Studies showing that women who carry the phone in their bra have developed cancers directly underneath where they hold the phone to their body. Thyroid cancer, a Yale study funded by the American Cancer Society actually found increased thyroid cancer in people who used phones more heavily than others, and in people who specifically had genetic dispositions, certain genetic makeup. And there are studies showing tumor promotion effects where, for example, studies where they took animals and they exposed them both to cell phone radiation frequencies as well as known carcinogens, and found a tumor promotion effect where those that got both had more cancers than those who only got one or the other. Then there are impacts to the brain, and that is what got me on this issue. It's what made me delve into the enormous amount of published studies when I read that there was impacts to memory, behavior, neurotransmitters, brain development, increases in headaches. I was like, wait a minute, we don't want to be messing with the brain. But when you think about it, when you hold the phone to your head, you are absorbing radiation right into your brain from that phone near your head. And even when you hold it out, that the brain is getting a level of absorption. And actually, there was just a study that came out looking at holding the phone to your head versus just being in a cell tower radiation exposure. And they measured the dose and found that, in fact, over time, you're getting more exposure from the cell tower, that full body, be it lower level, because it's just day and night, which is what's happening now with 5G and the proliferation of towers that are going up everywhere. So there's also impacts to the reproductive system, damaged sperm, decreased sperm, impacts to the ovaries in experimental studies, impacts to pregnancy outcomes, a lower birth weight. And you think about people putting that cell phone right in their pocket or sitting on the cell phone, as my stepbrother did. And at which I was shocked when that happened, but that's where we are with devices these days. It might as well be another appendage to the body. And endocrine system. There are endocrine impacts, and some scientists are stating, Dr. Linda Birnbaum talks about this shaping up to be a classic endocrine disruptor in terms of what we're seeing, impacts to the thyroid and to testosterone and other hormones. Those have been documented in numerous published studies. And for all of this, you're going to read when you dive into the science, well, more research needs to be done. More research always needs to be done. But when you look at the whole body of science, there is so many studies that cannot be ignored. And there is no question that there are biological impacts. And yet, we are increasing this with all of our use of wireless devices day and night. Synergistic effects, I talked a little bit about that, where tumor promotion, but there's also studies looking at lead, higher levels of lead in the body paired with higher cell phone radiation exposure, leading to, for example, in pregnant women, children who have more ADHD symptomology. Also studies on black carbon, which is an air pollutant, and finding impacts at the cellular level. And then there are impacts to wildlife, flora and fauna, and I'm going to be talking about that more, birds, bees, and trees, which is a whole other level that has been ignored for decades by federal governments. And just as an example, and yet another study, just yesterday, or 2 days ago, I'm sorry, this study came out looking to the microbiota, right, in mice from exposure to 3.5 gigahertz. And that's being used now in 5G. So 5G uses low bands that we've long used, frequencies that we've been using for over a decade in our telecommunications, and then mid-band, and then high band, and millimeter, sub-millimeter, and actually beyond into terahertz, which is being used experimentally. But 3.5 is being used now for 5G, and they found it induced anxiety-like behavior in mice. And they talk about, there's an image here just showing the alteration, like how there's the exposure impacts into the gut, into the flora, and then that leads to anxiety. And there's just many, many studies. You can go to PubMed or EMF portal, or go to ehtrust.org, to our website, where we periodically post. Please sign up for our newsletter at ehtrust.org, where you can stay up to date with everything going on. The majority of studies show harm, the majority. And Dr. Henry Lai is a scientist who periodically puts out summaries of the science. He compiles them. He looks at percentages in terms of what studies, how much studies of every endpoint has found what. And his latest, what he latest put out, it was, it's on Safer EMR, which is Dr. Joel Moskowitz's webpage on, it's his blog on wireless radiation. Again, that's Safer EMR, Dr. Joel Moskowitz. Please, if you're interested in this, that is another go-to site to learn more. He is a professor out of UC Berkeley working on public health, long worked on tobacco, and he posted Dr. Henry Lai's summaries, finding 77% of studies on neurological impacts found effects since 2007, 70% since 1990 of genetic studies looking at genetic impacts. And when you look at oxidative stress, that 89% showed an effect since 1977. Now, Dr. Henry Lai found DNA damage in animal brains back in the mid-90s. And he tells the story of these findings, and how after, documenting this and observing this, the science was attacked. He was personally attacked. In fact, there's an email, not an email, there was not an email then, it was a memo that between Motorola and Motorola's PR group that talked about war gaming Dr. Henry Lai's study, the findings. And that is actually how this issue has been addressed by corporations. is that they war game the science. They attack it, they attack the scientists, they downplay the findings, and thus the people, are left in the dark. We don't know. We think that there's doubt that there is an issue when there are scientists saying quite clearly, the science shows that this is a proven human carcinogen. There's several scientists who are saying that. Now, there are scientists that also say it's a probable, some say it's a possible, but nonetheless, when you're in a situation like this, what do? We have many scientists on one side and on the other side, and on the side that says, well, we're not sure yet, those scientists tend to be funded by the wireless industry, or they're relying on studies that were designed with funding by wireless companies. Doubt is their product. So I'll talk a little bit about that more in a bit. But already we have numerous governments that say children should reduce cell phone radiation. Now, many people in these countries aren't even aware that their own government agencies say it quite clearly on certain web pages. Now, you have to find it, and that's the challenge here. But it's actually stated on documents, on fact sheets, on the Public Health Organization's site. And that's because, of course, children are more vulnerable, and they have developing brains, they have smaller bodies, they have developing immune systems, and they need to be protected. So here we are in the United States, where the US government actually says, if you are worried, here are 3 things you can do. Well, by the way, many of these countries actually have very robust and complex web pages. They have public health campaigns, not all of them, some of them, and they explain this situation. Whereas in the United States, we are not provided that information. We have just a few websites which say almost nothing, which completely downplay the issue. I'll be talking more about that. And that's in contrast to, for example, this is the public health campaign in Cyprus. This is the back of a bus. They have public buses with full back of the bus ads. That's Greek. And on the other side, you have the English. Don't irradiate me. Learn how to protect me. The radiation is possibly carcinogenic. And they have a website and brochures and pamphlets that talk all about how exposure can be reduced to your child. They even have videos, a video for teenagers, a video for expecting mothers, a video for parents. And they explain how to reduce exposure. They explain why to reduce exposure. And yet in the United States, most people aren't even aware that there is an exposure, right? Now in California, the California Department of Public Health has a cell phone advisory that says, do not sleep with your phone in your bed or near your head. It talks about using speakerphone and reducing exposure to your phone. It talks about how children are more vulnerable to wireless radiation. And it was kept under wraps for years, for a decade, actually, only revealed when Dr. Joel Moskowitz filed a public information request, a Freedom of Information request in California, and forced the department to release this advisory, which, as it turns out, had been edited and re-edited and redrafted for years since it was first drafted. And in the first draft, by the way, it talked about the California state employees ensuring that they know about this, ensuring that they know how to protect their families, ensuring that the state purchase low radiation phones. It had this whole, it was like this unbelievably long document about what to do. And when this was finally released just a few years ago, after the Freedom of Information Act request forced this to be released, it was just 2 pages, completely watered down, but still actually very powerful because it still talks about children. It talks about phones. But there are things that were eliminated, like cordless phones. And certainly when this was drafted many years ago, we didn't have Alexa or Wi-Fi routers everywhere, or all of these devices that we have now. Nonetheless, that advisory has been released, and the California Department of Health says that you should reduce exposure to your kids. Now, there's also, my goodness, appeals, statements, scientific, long documents talking about the science and what's recommended by scientists going back for decades as well. We have these on our website at ehtrust.org. The EMF scientist appeal is one place to start. That is 258 scientists from 44 nations who have published on the issue of non-ionizing electromagnetic fields. And they talk about the scientific evidence, and they have requests. They have recommendations to the World Health Organization and the UN to take urgent action. And they also talk about that children and pregnant women need to be protected. Regulations need to be strengthened, that manufacturers need to develop safer technology. The public needs to be informed, and governments need to fund research that's independent of industry. And also, they talk about how the media needs to disclose experts' financial relationships with industry when they're citing their opinions. So, for example, if you just type in cell phones and health or wireless and health, there are tons of news articles. They're short little news articles. And right there, the science is being downplayed by certain scientists, but they don't say that those scientists have been funded by the wireless industry, of which numerous have that are cited. I'll talk more about that more. And that's never presented. So we think, or the public thinks, that everything's safe, that wireless is safe, and these experts say so. But we need to know about that financial relationship, because studies have shown that when there is a financial funding into studies, that they more often don't show effects, right? And studies that are done by independent scientists don't more often show effects. And the EMF scientist appeal also recommends safe zones, radiation-free zones that need to be established so that people have a safe place to go. People who have developed symptoms or want to protect themselves, they need a safe place. And what you see on the left side is what you see on the left side is these New York 5G towers that are sprouting up all over the city, many of which are already installed. They are sometimes closer than 10 feet. We found one at 9.5 feet, right from bedroom windows. This is one of hundreds. Now, there's groups in New York City that are working on this. There are over 16 community boards that are saying, we don't want this, we don't like this, this needs to stop. They've issued resolutions, moratoriums, letters of disapproval. And so that's all happening as we speak. But nonetheless, these are up. And it's part of the insanity and the hubris of this whole situation. I mean, radiation aside, these are ugly. They have no place anywhere. And yet they are being put upon us despite not being asked. I mean, the people who live near these installations, not just in New York City, but all over the country, are often told that our hands are tied by elected officials. We can't do anything about this. There's nothing we can do. I'm hopping back to cell phones for a second. So this is this little folding phone, the Galaxy Z Fold 3 5G. And my dad actually has a phone like this. I just was with him this weekend, and I was just shocked that he would have such a phone. He's almost 90 years old, and he's got this flip phone. And I said, well, why did you pick this phone? And he said, well, I wanted something that would fit into my pocket. Into my pants or into my front pocket. And I'm like, oh, even though I've been talking about this for a long time, but nonetheless, and I explained to him that if you go into the phone, it says that the testing, it's called SAR testing for the radiation testing, it's been carried out at a distance. For this phone, if you go into the instructions of the phone, there's an RF exposure disclaimer which says body wear SAR testing has been carried out at a separation distance of 1.5 centimeters. And to meet the radio frequency exposure guidelines during body-worn operation, the device should be positioned away from the body. And yet people don't know that. That's about the RF radiation that comes out of these devices. Now, I gotta tell you, if you keep the phone at that distance, that does not mean safety or that your health is protected. What that means is that, well, it doesn't even mean that, which is like a whole other story, that supposedly you are going to meet the regulations of the US government. US government regulations are from 1996, outdated and non-protected, but nonetheless, that is what this statement is about. Most people don't even know that. We are putting the phones in our pockets where you're going to get about 2 millimeter distance, and you're not going to have it far enough away to ensure you're even meeting our outdated, irrelevant government regulations. So anyway, all devices have these statements, and we have a site at Environmental Health Trust under the fine print warnings, which we call them, that goes over the fine print warnings of all of these devices. If you want to find it in your Apple iPhone, you go to Settings, General, About, Legal RF Exposure, and you can find that it'll say 5 millimeters. Now, Apple actually changed what it says in their little statement. It used to be clear that the phone was tested at a distance away from the body, and that in order to maintain compliance with our completely outdated government laws, well, I'm saying that they don't say that in order to maintain compliance, that you need to keep the phone at that distance. They changed that around 2017, and they made it so it's even more hard to understand. And it does have the 5 millimeter wording in there, but it does not really clarify the reality of the situation. Whereas the other phone companies, I think their legal teams just haven't gotten to that yet, so they haven't confused us. And what we're told is, of course, there's lots to love, less to spend. We are never told about the radiation that is being emitted from these devices. We are never told that the way these devices are tested for safety, which is not even a proper test, it's fraudulent. It's fraudulent. Look at what they do. They have this big head, an adult male head, where they fill it with a liquid that's supposed to simulate the brain. How a homogeneous liquid can simulate the brain is more than questionable, because, of course, the brain has areas that are thick and areas that are thin, and the radiation moves differently. There actually can be hot spots. That's been documented in studies on cow brains when cell phone radiation is close to the brain tissue. Nonetheless, before a phone comes to market, a phone is placed up to this big head. He's called Sam, short for specific anthropomorphic mannequin. And what you see with that little, let me see if I can do this. With this is like a temperature stick, and it makes sure that the heat does not get too high inside the head from the phone. That is the pre-market compliance tests, just based on heat, using this outdated model of even what our bodies are like. This doesn't consider children. It doesn't consider the majority of people that are using devices that are much smaller than this big head. Also, devices are tested when it comes to the body. Oh, and I need to say something which you can't tell here, but the ear, you'll often hear, if you dive into this, as many people do, that the phone is tested against the head. Well, it's actually tested against an ear, and the ear is used as a spacer. It's never like tested against, like, you know how some people, they hold phones like this, okay, right into the temple, or like that. I mean, I've seen, every which way. They're not tested that way. The antenna is very close, depending on your phone, to the skull. Totally different than what you're seeing here, because there's actually several millimeters of space between where the antennas are and the head in these positions. When it comes to the body testing that's done, they do a body test too. There's a distance that's used. And many phones have 5 millimeters, some have 10, some have 15. In fact, the US government allows phones to be tested for compliance at up to 25 millimeters, which is wild. Who keeps a phone at 25 millimeters? But for a long time, many phones were at that distance. And this, what you're seeing here, is actually an image from the French government. So many countries are just way ahead of us in terms of transparency and compliance testing. They haven't made it to the endpoint, but they're doing much better than we are in the US. And what you're seeing is how the phone is tested at 5 millimeters. And they also have tests that are at 0 millimeters that the French government did. Nonetheless, most test phones are tested at 5 or more millimeters for compliance tests. I just wanted to show you this. This is the Apple iPhone 11 with the 5 millimeter separation. When the French government did tests at body contact, they found the majority of them exceeded limits. If you want to learn about that, go to PhoneGate and the PhoneGate alert website, where you'll see that dozens, over 40 phones have been found to exceed limits. Those phones have been software updated, or they have been actually taken off the market in France because of what France is doing. However, that hasn't translated out here in the United States, nor in all the other countries other than France. And in fact, the French government should be, in our opinion, of course, looking at all the phones at body contact, but the phones that exceeded limits at body contact, they're not able to take action on, because right now the law doesn't say that you must test phones at body contact. That's what's so outrageous about all of this. And yet here we have kids. I mean, this image is pretty typical, right? You're in a grocery store. The babies have phones, the toddlers are watching videos, and yet there is zero pre-market safety tests for long-term health effects. All it is are these ridiculous the head test and this body test with the distance, but there's no tests looking at long-term health effects that the US government is doing as a part of its pre-market safety protocol. We know from studies that children absorb this radiation proportionately more into their brains by 2 to 3 times, and 10 times higher into their skull. There have been many studies that have been done. This is a animation from scientific modeling done by Claudio Fernandez and engineers from Brazil in collaboration with Environmental Health Trust, just showing how when a phone is near the head, the absorption into the child brain and into the adult brain. And the colors represent the rate. So this is a heating metrics, but yet it is the metrics that is currently being used. It's called the SAR, but it goes from the highest, which is white, to yellow, to orange, to red, to purple, to blue. And you can see that the child head, the head is smaller. There's also different tissues have more water in children, so they have the radiation moves faster into that tissue. Thinner skulls, of course, smaller heads. So of course you're going to get proportionally more exposure into a child. And of course they're going to have a lifetime of exposure. Now, virtual reality is being promoted all over. I mean, you can't go on Facebook without these meta ads, and what it is smartphones being put right up to the eyes. Of course, you're getting exposures into the brain, but also into the eyes. And modeling that's been done, published on the absorption into the eye from virtual reality positioned smartphones, where they're put right up in that cardboard container or in an apparatus, has found 2 to 5 times higher cell phone radiation absorption proportionately into children's eyes. And that's a whole other issue. And it ain't just children, right? We're talking about adults too. Our eyes are being exposed. What you need to know about the eyes, however, is that children's eyes, just like their brain, just like their immune system, they are still developing. So there can be more of an impact because more of that, they're more exposed. They don't have the protections on their eyes that adults actually have as the eye ages. And children are exposed from babies, from before they're even born, right? When you're pregnant and women are using their abdomen as a shelf. Now, the American Academy of Pediatrics has put out several letters and recommendations on this issue. They are calling for an update to cell phone radiation limits. They say children are not little adults, and they are disproportionately impacted by all environmental exposures, including cell phone radiation. They have 10 tips for families to reduce exposure, which came out after the U.S. National Toxicology Program found clear evidence of a certain kind of tumors in male rats that were exposed. And this study, by the way, the NIH National Toxicology Program study, was done because there was not enough data, well done data on long-term exposure. And the FDA asked NIH, the National Toxicology Program study of NIH, to do research on animals in order to find out, could there be a problem? They exposed animals for 2 years. They found effects, not just tumors of the heart and in the brain, but also DNA damage, low birth weight, and yet the FDA then turned around and said, well, we don't agree with these findings, even though they asked for the study. Anyway, it's a whole story. Please learn more at Environmental Health Trust or watch some of my earlier talks. I talk about that. And so how do we reduce exposure to phones? I'm starting out with phones. I'm going to hop into towers, and then I'm going to go to wildlife as well. Don't put your phone in your pocket. You are exposing your abdomen, your reproductive parts, your intestines to cell phone radiation. Keep the cell phone out of your pants. Keep the cell phone out of your bra, and don't press it up against your chest. Make the phone a no phone, make the bra a no cell phone zone. Use speakerphone instead of putting the phone up to your head. Text instead of a voice or video call. But hold the phone away from your body, not up to your chest. You see, in this position, the phone is pretty close to the chest, and there are studies that have been done. There's case reports on the young girls who put the phone into their bra and have cancers underneath where they hold the phone. But also, there are studies that have looked at how people use their phones and found increased breast cancer in women who use the phone right around their abdomen area, because you're getting that exposure to the chest. And yet, this is typical. This is what is the norm. People don't know about the fine print warnings. They don't know that their cell phone emits radiation. They don't know that here you have an exposure going into a child's body that could have repercussions over time. They need to know. Now, the Connecticut Department of Health has some recommendations on cell phones. At this point, this was from a few years ago, and they need to update all of their materials, but nonetheless, they say, make shorter phone calls. Less time with the phone next to your ear means less exposure. And scientists also agree that it is wise to reduce exposure to RF energy from cell phones whenever possible. Some people say to me, Theodora, people don't use the phone up to their head anymore. They're only texting. But we're in a both and situation. Yes, people are texting right up to their chest. But yes, people are also holding that phone up to their ear. especially lawyers, real estate agents, folks who are workers, who are construction site workers. They are talking to clients, they are on that phone. The phone is at the ear, or they're using a wireless earpiece. So in fact, we have no unexposed group really anymore. I don't know where you'd find them at this point. Another thing that can be done to reduce, but not eliminate exposure, is to disable antennas when you're not using them. The Athens Medical Association is one of many medical associations with recommendations on how to reduce exposure. And you can turn off the Wi-Fi, the Bluetooth, the data, the 5G, the cellular. If you're not using it, turn it off so it's not always transmitting. That's one little step that you can do. It doesn't eliminate exposure, and we don't have to go back to this old style phone, although I love them. However, we do need to use corded phones whenever possible. And I have, for example, in my office, a corded phone, which I use all the time. I am on the phone for hours every day, and I use a corded phone. Now, you can't get a copper landline in many communities anymore. No worries. There you can get an internet phone. There are voice over IP. We have it connected with our internet. When we buy the internet, we also have a phone line. Some people use, voice over IP, and you just plug in your phone, and all the jacks in my home work. So think about that. Please go to our website at healthytechhome.org to get all kinds of tips and tricks on how to use phones in safer ways, how to install your phone, how to, instead of using laptops and tablets wirelessly, you can connect. Actually, I want to get my cord to show you, but you can connect with an Ethernet. It's much safer. You don't have to have everything wireless. Here's, of course, a typical, this is what kids are doing, right? Their face is smack in front of the screen. Not good for their eyes because of the blue light. And also they're getting the Wi-Fi radiation exposure. It's unnecessary. We can connect with Ethernet. That eliminates the radio frequencies. So the first question, and here's another link 5G from New York City that people ask me is, well, what are the government standards for cell towers and cell phones? And, help me understand all of this. And I'm actually writing a chapter on that right now. I stay up to date with EHT, and we'll be able to read a more in-depth look at our regulations. But the regulations that we have limits for human exposure in the US for what's allowed to be in the air from cell towers or wireless networks. We also have limits on the cell phone emissions, and they have been unchanged since 1996 when they were set. Unreviewed in terms of looking at all of the science, but they were set in 1996. Now they're based on studies that are from the 80s and actually also the 70s. And they are not designed to address biological impacts like cancer, impacts to the brain, memory, impacts to thyroid or hormones. They are not designed to address modern technology and the real world exposure of numerous devices at once. You might have a cell tower outside your window, and you're using a phone, and you're looking at a wireless laptop, and you're wearing a smartwatch. Yet the way, the structure that we have for limits does not consider all of that at once. It just considers one thing at a time, one phone at a time, one smartwatch at a time. It doesn't combine those near and far field exposures. It also doesn't address children's vulnerability. A lot of the science on impacts to children and pregnancy, that has been more recently published post 1996. But the FCC limits have not shown that they never even had that data at the time. And they certainly didn't have the data on long-term exposures. They just didn't have the amount of science that we have now. And they also didn't have studies or even a consideration for environmental impacts, impacts to birds, to bees, to trees, not a part of the limits. These limits are human exposure limits. I'll circle back to that. But in 2019, the FCC decided that its RF limits did not need to be updated. It made a decision after many years of asking the question and accepting submissions about should our limits be updated? Do the limits adequately protect children? Should we have a precautionary approach? These were questions that the FCC posed to the public, and people submitted saying, yes, we need more protections. Yes, we need to update. Yes, we need a full scientific review, and children need protections, and wildlife needs protection. But the FCC decided in 2019 that actually it didn't, that we could just keep our limits. There didn't need to be a full update that happened. Now, this was not an update in 2019. This was a determination by the FCC that the limits did not need to be go through the process of being updated. And taking a hop back, I want to talk a little bit more about the limits. They were based on studies on a threshold of heating, a level of heating that they identified from studies from the 70s and 80s with just a few rodents and a few small monkeys, where they put microwave frequencies that elevated the heat for under 60 minutes. Under 60 minutes of exposure, high microwave exposure, and these little animals had been trained to press a lever for food. And when they were microwaved, and they were starved before the exposures to make sure that they were hungry, when the animals stopped pressing the lever for food, the mostly engineers said, well, okay, we've reached the heating level. These animals are overheated, their whole body's overheated, and this is bad. And they decided that that was the level of adverse effect, this overheating under 60 minutes of exposure. And that is how those limits were set so far, decades ago. That is how the first idea that the limits need to be based on heating, like a microwave, not on biological effects, cancer, neurological effects, hormones, thyroid, so forth. So when the FCC made that decision in 2019, Environmental Health Trust sued the FCC, saying, you have not looked at all the science. You haven't looked at the up-to-date science. And by the way that you test phones and you test cell towers, it's not relevant to the exposures we actually have. Other groups also did the same, Children's Health Defense, many individuals, many scientists. I personally sued myself. My name is on this case. There are over a dozen petitioners. And the case, Environmental Health Trust et al. Versus the FCC, there was a decision by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, that's just under the Supreme Court, the circuit courts. They ruled that the FCC's decision not to update its 1996 limits was arbitrary and capricious. The court found that the FCC had not provided evidence of properly examining long-term exposure, children's vulnerability, the RF radiation compliance test procedures that use that distance or that don't look at cumulative sources, the testimony of people who are injured. There were hundreds of testimonies by people who had various injuries, who talked about getting a brain tumor after long-term cell phone use, getting headaches, being debilitated by high levels of RF radiation from towers, perhaps, that went up near their home, or smart meters that went on their home and then they became ill. Just hundreds of testimonies, and yet the FCC ignored that when it made its decision in 2019. The FCC also was found to ignore the studies on impacts to the reproductive system and to the brain. And the court said that the FCC had completely failed. It had a complete failure to address environmental effects, impacts to birds, bees, and trees, all of which were on the official record. There were over 10,000 pages of studies and scientific papers that had been submitted, most of which were completely ignored by the FCC, and the court saw that. The court then had an official mandate, an order to the US government and the FCC to explain how its limits were protective of the issues it had ignored. And it had a mandate that went out saying, you need to show and explain how the 1996 limits address the impacts of long-term exposure, of the test distance, of impacts, non-cancer impacts like impacts to the brain and reproduction, and impacts to the environment. And also, the court said, you need to explain how your 1996 limits even protect with modern technology, and the way we have technology today is totally different, of course, than from 1996. So explain how those limits really apply. Now, in talking about these, I forgot probably the most important thing, which is that the FCC has not responded. There's been no response. That was in 2021. We're now, years later, and still no response from the FCC, not a peep. Now, in the meantime, I have been submitting all of the latest science to the FCC, because the FCC is even making new rules and talking about new frequencies that it wants to have human exposure limits on, yet they do not have safety data on that. So I have continued to submit science to the FCC so that they will have it on their official record. And frankly, so that as there will be future lawsuits, that will be documented that they knew. They have not responded to this court ruling. The other thing I need to add is that they didn't go to the Supreme Court to challenge this ruling. This ruling stands, and yet the FCC has not responded. Therefore, the FCC cannot say that, or any entity, companies cannot say that the limits of the US government, the FCC human exposure limits, that they have, that they rest on a full research review of all of the up-to-date science. Now, let's look at our limits for cell towers and wireless radiation in the air as applied to homes and schools. This shows a country comparison of just a few select countries. Now, I have put, for example, Switzerland and Italy. They have limits that are applicable. They have limits, and then they have limits that apply for homes and schools where you live for some countries say, where you reside, where you are for over 4 hours a day. They have all different rules, but nonetheless, these are sort of what the effective limits are for inside your home, and you're right outside of your home, and where young children. Some even apply to where hospitals are. The way our limits are, it depends on the frequency, but just as an example, for the 1,800 megahertz frequency, the US government and Japan have among the highest, the least restrictive, the most lenient limits for what cell towers are allowed to emit, compared to many countries in the world. We have just given it all to the cell tower companies, okay? It's a gift that we have given. The Australia and actually many other countries have limits that use ICNIRP limits, and those are slightly lower, still heat-based, very lenient compared to other countries such as Switzerland, Italy, Russia, China, India, and actually many Eastern European countries that allow that have more restrictive, more stringent limits for cell towers. The international, just to give you some perspective, on the opposition or the awareness in some groups and some entities over time, the International Association of Firefighters is one of many organizations officially opposed to cell towers, on their stations, if you look internationally. Now, the International Association of Firefighters came out with a resolution on cell towers on their stations because there had been some early studies that found impacts to neurological impacts when cell antennas were mounted on their stations. And they have a resolution which states that until a study with the highest scientific merit and integrity on the health effects of exposure to low intensity radiofrequency microwave radiation is conducted, and it is proven that such sightings are not hazardous to the health of our members, they don't want cell towers on their stations. And in fact, when in LA, actually in California too, but what I'm about to show you is from LA. It's a little ad, 30-second ad that the firefighter unions put out related to installations that were going up on LA stations. And here is the ad that they put out to galvanize the community against putting cell towers on their stations. Oops. Sorry.
Firefighters living and working beneath cell towers like this one have gotten sick. Headaches, extreme fatigue, memory loss, and brain scans show that firefighters exposed to toxic RF radiation experience cell death, ALS, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's disease. Now, the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors has approved cell tower installations on fire stations in neighborhoods like yours. Call the Board of Supervisors and tell them to stop the cell towers now.
And there are many such efforts by firefighter unions in California. In fact, when there was a 5G fast track streamlining law, actually several of them that have been either proposed or ultimately passed, the firefighter unions were able to carve their stations out of the legislation because they lobbied hard, saying that they didn't want their stations to be cell tower sites. Yet, across the nation, we are seeing many fire stations of cell towers on them. That's because the firefighters are not fully aware of all of the science and all of the research. And we have a webpage on ehtrust.org that talks about firefighters. You can just search firefighters and you'll get to that page where we have everything about the firefighter unions, the California firefighters, the International Association of Firefighters, and what's going on. And here's another example, right? We've got these rooftop antennas. I mean, they're ugly, but they also emit invisible radiation that's going out all over cities across the United States. Rooftop antennas on near where homes are that are emanating out. I mean, we are contacted by people all the time that are finding they developed headaches or other physical health effects, and they realize that there's a cell antenna right outside because you've got this building, then you've got a building right next to it, right? So the building next to it they're in line of sight of these antennas where the main beam is. And people have reported getting sick. They are going to their senators, their elected officials, and being told that, well, the federal government, FCC limits, they're compliant with that, and there's nothing we can do. This is unacceptable, and we are working to change that. So here's another example of the Link 5G antennas. We are told, here's a clip from an ad, that this is 5G built right. We're building the most powerful 5G experience in more places around the country now so more people can experience it. This is what we are told by the companies. That's an advertisement. What we're not told is that 5G is being built right in front of our homes. And that is what it means. And allowing there are 50 states, actually, over 50 states that have laws, state laws that make it so local communities can't have all the restrictions that they may want regarding these kinds of installations in the rights of way. And at the state level, wireless companies are lobbying hard and have lobbied hard to get those state streamlining laws so that they can do this, and so the local city council or the local town can't stop it. And please, again, ehtrust.org to learn more. Here are some pictures. This picture was sent to me by a professor in Pennsylvania. And here's this, looks small, right? It's like this little, and this is a picture from a separate facility in New Orleans, but this looks pretty small, right? Well, it's actually the radiation that is coming off of that. This professor shared with me the RF reports. It was so high. I have never seen such high levels in a house as I have from this facility right outside her third floor bedroom window. She can't use the third floor of her house now. Can't use it. The levels are just excessive inside that window. It's coming through the window, and so she doesn't use the third floor at all. Because of that, it's right in line of sight of the window. And here's another example in New Orleans. They're going up everywhere. I mean, this is just so close to the home there. And there are many, many studies, as I talked about. Again, you can learn more at ehtrust.org. But one I'll point out is a Europarlament Study Service research report from 2021 called The Health Impact of 5G that concluded for the wireless frequencies that are in use now, that 5G is using, those low band frequencies, that it is probably carcinogenic in humans, in particular related to glioma, a kind of brain tumor, and acoustic neuroma. And they also talked about reproductive and developmental effects, stating that these frequencies clearly affect male fertility and possibly female fertility too. They may have possible adverse effects on the development of embryos, fetuses, and newborns. So if you're grappling with this issue in your community, take a look at that study. It's a useful one to share with your elected officials on this issue. Now, companies know. They know and have known for decades, far more than from the year 2000, when the Ecolog Institute report was put out, that there are effects at much lower levels than is legally allowed. As an example, T-Mobile funded a study that came out in 2000. It's called the Ecolog Institute report. They recommended, based on the studies at that time, about 2.5 decades ago, that there be an exposure limit 1,000 times lower than FCC's current power density limit. 1,000 times lower. The Los Angeles, California School District, after a lot of parents and teachers organized on the issue and shared the science, they developed what they call a cautionary level for radio frequency radiation 10,000 times lower than FCC regulations. So when we're talking about the US government limits being out of date, I'm not talking about by 10 times or 5 times or 50 times. We're talking about hundreds, thousands, in fact, tens of thousands, in fact, even more than that times, because when you start to look at the science, you realize there are studies that have found it affects very, very low levels. We need to switch to safe technology now. What's happening right now is really out of control, and it's invisible, so people don't realize it. And of course, we're all addicted to our devices. Now, I'd like to make a point, and that is that the Los Angeles School District has questionably applied this limit, just as in many of the countries that have more restrictive limits. It depends. We don't know the degree to which they are following that due to, for many reasons, of course, corporate influence, as well as simply neglect, as well as a lack of compliance. But nonetheless, in addition to this conservative level that, for example, the Los Angeles School District has on their fact sheet, in which they recommend, they also have bans on cell towers on school property. They also have a resolution saying they don't want cell towers near their schools. And just another quote from the Los Angeles, California Public School District: "It is believed that a more conservative level is necessary to protect children who represent a potentially vulnerable and sensitive population." And here we are again with these 5G towers going up right now. And if you look inside, here is an image from one of the towers done by Julie Marden, who took pictures across the city. You can see how gigantic this monstrosity is. And here you have the specs from the New York Office of Technology, where they show how inside the facility, these are all tiers for various antennas that will include not just Wi-Fi and wireless, but millimeter waves and 5G. And, you know, what an outrage. What an outrage. What's not being told when these 5G facilities are proposed is that insurance authorities have rated this technology as a high impact risk, an off the leash risk. Swiss Re has a report called 5G Off the Leash, and they consider this a high impact emerging risk due to the potential negative health effects from electromagnetic fields, which they state are likely to increase over time. They also talk about hacking and exploiting 5G to steal data and privacy, security, and espionage issues, all of which are so important in 5G privacy. And just a quote, as the biological effects of EMF in general and 5G in particular are still being debated, potential claims for health impairments may come with a long latency. That means we might not see it now, but we're going to see it later. And that is why, in fact, insurance companies don't insure cell phone companies or cell tower companies for damages, and they haven't for decades. They're not taking the risk. There was a report from 2010 by Lloyd's of London, which compared it to asbestos, and actually several reports comparing the legal liability risks to asbestos. Lloyd's of London said, the danger with EMFs is that, like asbestos, the exposure insurers face is underestimated and could grow exponentially and be with us for many years. It is, in fact, the industry standard to exclude EMFs in general policies. In fact, it is defined as a pollution. Non-ionizing electromagnetic fields, even though they're non-ionizing, is defined as a pollution in insurance policies. And as well, the companies themselves, they define it as a pollution. Here is just a little screen save from a Verizon, like total mobile protection insurance that you can buy for your phone. And it says that this insurance doesn't apply to certain exclusions. One of them is pollution. And the definition of pollution includes artificially produced electric fields, magnetic fields, electromagnetic fields, sound waves, microwaves, and all artificially produced ionizing or non-ionizing radiation and or waste. I mean, there it is, right? So in fact, there are many lawsuits, and that's a whole bucket of information that if you are connected with groups, you will stay up to date on. But because of the lawsuits around this issue that have been going back decades, companies, cell phone companies, they warn shareholders of risk, but not consumers or neighbors or people living near their equipment. They say in their 10K filings, and all the cell tower companies have filings that they do to the federal government related to and to their shareholders, where they say, for example, as Crown Castle says, if radio frequency emissions from wireless handsets or equipment on our communications infrastructure are demonstrated to cause negative health effects, potential future claims could adversely affect our operations, costs, or revenues. We currently do not maintain any significant insurance with respect to these matters. They tell you they don't have insurance. And they need to do that because later in time, when the lawsuits become, when there's winning lawsuits, which we believe there will be, at that time, shareholders are going to say, wait, why didn't you warn us? And that's, they have to let the shareholders know. But they don't let us know. Here, let me show you what this image is. This is a T-Mobile installation at a Detroit school where the parents worked so hard to try to stop these antennas from transmitting, but were unable to, despite quite the valiant effort, I must say. And you can just look up Wyandotte in Michigan, and you can learn more about that, the story of that specific school installation. And by the way, in Detroit, Michigan, they are up all over, and dozens of schools, actually. This is right in the playground, beaming down into the playground. In fact, T-Mobile says in its report, the FCC has from time to time gathered data regarding wireless device emissions, and its assessment of the risks associated with using wireless devices may evolve based on its findings. So here, T-Mobile is actually talking about how what the FCC says about risks may change. They're not saying safety is assured. We know it's safe. It's proven safe. No, they don't say that. They caution that there may be a change. Any of these allegations or changes in risk assessments could result in customers purchasing fewer devices and wireless services, could result in significant legal and regulatory liability, and could have a material adverse effects on our business, reputation, financial condition, cash flows, and operating results. So again, they warn their shareholders, but not the consumers, not us, not the people. And here is the cell tower near the high school, which I went to many years ago. And here it is, this antenna, and as you can see, right on top are two birds. I think three actually, but here it is, so close to the school. And by the way, the playing field is on the other side, and that is where you get the high level of exposure to, is right there, about 200 to 300 feet out, depending on the antennas. And I don't know if you can tell, but there's actually some trees downed here, because what happened was there were all these trees that were along that fence, and there's all these trees that were actually around the backside too. The majority of them are dead and gone since this tower has been up, which I'm going to talk more about. There are school boards and school communities across the nation opposing and or banning new cell towers on school property. Los Angeles Board of Education, the Palo Alto, California Unified School District resolution. They support the city, which has a 1,500-foot setback, and they for towers near schools, and they oppose cell towers on or in close proximity to schools to ensure individuals, especially children, are protected from the potential negative health effects associated with radiation exposure. The West Linn Wilsonville, Oregon School Board, the Greenbelt, Maryland City Council, in my community where I used to live, they issued an opposition to cell towers at schools when every single school in the entire district was part of this whole leasing plan that had happened unbeknownst to the majority of the community. Whole story there. Then there is the Temecula Valley in California Unified School District. They just passed a ban on new cell towers or renewing existing cell tower leases for towers on school property. If you're interested in this, please contact Environmental Health Trust. We have a toolkit, and we're really working on this cell tower near school issue. Now, more recently, if you're wondering about the science, one study I would just point out, because I could give you 100 or I could give you one that's like a good starting study, which is a review by Alfonso Balmori, published just in 2022, called Evidence for Health Risk by RF on Humans Living Around Mobile Phone Base Stations from Radiofrequency Sickness to Cancer. And that study looked at a lot of the studies on people living near cell towers. And they, I'm going too fast. And they found documentation of three major buckets of issues. One was cancer, biochemical changes in the blood, and other changes that you can test for, as well as radiofrequency sickness, headaches, neurological issues, brain fog, that constellation of impacts that people have found when they are overexposed to cell tower or Wi-Fi wireless radiation. A really important study published in Environmental Research. Now, also, There is a study published a few years earlier by Pierce called Limiting Liability with Positioning to Minimize the Negative Health Effects of Cellular Phone Towers. This is a publication for companies, for municipalities, saying if you want to minimize your risk and liability, it's best to have a 500-foot setback. Restrict antennas, base station antennas, those are cell tower, rooftop mounted base station antennas near homes, schools, and hospitals to 500 meters, okay, to protect companies from future liability. And that is because, one, there's this growing science. Two, there's no oversight on cell tower and 5G antennas. There's no entity that is looking at the science, all of the science, all the up-to-date science to ensure safety. In fact, when I raise this issue and when people across the country raise the issue of wireless radiation, they're told, oh, the FDA says it's safe. Except the FDA has no authority over cell tower radiation. They even said in multiple emails, which are all documented on the Trust site, that, for example, the director of the FDA Office of Policy and Center for Devices and Radiological Health said in a 2020 email, the FDA does not regulate cell towers or cell tower radiation. Therefore, the FDA has no studies or information on cell towers to provide in response to your questions. That was in response to a mother that had written about a cell tower near her home. And yet, here we are. This is Bennett Elementary in Detroit, where over a dozen schools have these antennas mounted, beaming right into the playgrounds. And it is outrageous, just outrageous that our country doesn't have a restriction on cell towers near or on school property. Many countries have actually banned cell towers on schools. The Santa Clara County Medical Association, another great resource for toxins in the air and water, and also electromagnetic fields. They have a best practices for school document where they recommend that there be the restriction of towers at least 1,640 feet from schools. And so does the New Hampshire 5G Commission final report. So do many, many studies that have been published that looked at all of the science. In fact, human rights experts, and we have this on our website on the cell towers page, they have published a study saying this is a human rights issue because children have no say right now. We're talking about their future. And what could be, we need to protect their future and not just play Russian roulette. Really, it's not even playing a game. We know that this radiation has, that there's documented biological effects. So it's not benign. Now, in the school setting, there are high exposures to multiple sources, not just the cell towers outside, but the cell phones. Every kid has a cell phone, maybe two. The laptops, tablets, the Wi-Fi routers, the cell boosters, the projectors, the smartwatches, fitness trackers, keyboards, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, all over, right? This is the school setting. And in fact, several studies have found elevated levels in classrooms because of this, more so than in your home, more so than in other areas, because you have this density of devices. And also with all of these kids on all of their phones, which are transmitting, they're not turned off. This is a really important issue that we are also highly focused on at Environmental Health Trust. The Santa Clara California Medical Association has recommendations for best practices for technology in schools. Create a Safe Tech in Schools program to educate students and teachers and the school community on reducing wireless radiation. Create cell phone-free policies for the classroom. That's just a great starting, easy do. Just cell phone-free policy. It helps with teaching as well as the radiation. Have them turned off and stowed away. Some schools have them go in these pouches, and those pouches, but really we need to make sure that they're turned off. That's very important, or they're still transmitting. Prefer hardwired Ethernet devices instead of Wi-Fi. Have professional measurements done for the RF levels, and avoid installation of smart meters. These are just a few of the recommendations of the Santa Clara Medical Association. There's also the New Jersey Education Association did a report on this. The Maryland State Advisory Council on Children and Environmental Health Protection. I worked on that, has recommendations for schools, and many entire governments have recommendations for schools, which is all on our website again. So please think about this. If you have kids, get involved, contact us. There's also Tech Safe Schools. Now on to another issue, birds, bees, trees, and wireless. We have all of these branded wireless products, right? You've got Amazon Echo Alexa speakers, which are animal. They have animal prints. We have Save the Bees phone cases, a phone case that is a bee. And yet this radiation, which is emerging out, is going right into animals' living space. And they are being exposed to such high levels because they perch right on top of antennas, right? They are right there in the high beam. Birds are flying, trees are right in that space, limbs are right in that space, and of course, insects are right in that space. And these limits that we have were never meant to apply to animals. They are only for humans. No country has developed science-based environmental exposure limits to protect wildlife, to protect plants, to protect trees, street trees. They just haven't been developed that way. We have a severe regulatory gap. And it's not like we haven't known for a long time. This study was in the FCC, proceeding. The FCC was given this study. It was a review from 2013 that found significant effects on birds, insects, other vertebrates, other organisms, and plants in 70% of the studies, with the development and reproduction of birds and insects the most strongly affected endpoints. Yet the FCC ignored this study. And look, here are these birds perched right on the antennas. Now, later in 2021, and actually several other studies that I want to talk about. But in 2021, there was a landmark review published by US experts. You can look up, there's Dr. Henry Lai, Blake Levitt, as well as Albert Manville, who formerly worked at the US Fish and Wildlife Service. They did this incredible comprehensive review of over 1,200 studies on impacts to flora and fauna. They found biological effects across all taxa, all species that had been looked at, and all frequency studies, and at vanishingly low intensities comparable to today's ambient exposures. And they say broad wildlife effects have been seen on orientation, migration, food finding, reproduction, mating, nest and den building, territorial maintenance and defense, and longevity and survivorship. Cyto and genotoxic effects have been observed. Very important three-part review that was again submitted to the FCC. And yet, the FCC has so far ignored it and not responded to the order to address environmental impacts. Just last year, a published systematic review on insects was published, and reviews on environmental health. And they found, as we've known, that the vast majority of studies found effects, generally harmful ones, in a nutshell. And the majority of studies on wireless radiation found effects, including to reproduction, development, metabolism, behavior, orientation, memory, oxidative stress, and DNA damage. And then, of course, we have this situation where 5G is going to use these higher frequencies, never used commercially in the way they're being used. And those so-called small cells, which are not small, which are emitting the sub-millimeter and millimeter frequencies. What about the impacts to insects and to bees and pollinators? What you're seeing here is a study that looked just at exposure. And they took a bee, they modeled it, they simulated the exposure into the bee body from frequencies at the same power level, but at different frequencies, showing frequencies currently in use to the 5G frequencies and beyond. So here you can see 2 gigahertz, 6 gigahertz, 12 gigahertz, and 24 gigahertz. And what they found is that as the frequencies got higher, closer to the size of the insect, that the absorption increased because there is a level at which there's a resonance for not just bodies, but actually various skin tissue structures. And resonance means that the exposure goes all the way through and is entirely different than when you're not at that level. You think about an opera singer singing and a glass breaks. How does that happen? There's this pitch, there's this moment where the note hits exactly where it resonates with the glass breaks. But yet the same amount of sound at a different note does not have the same effect. And that's a way to think about this issue. So this was a very important study. Thielens et al. There's actually three now, studies that these scientists have been a part of where they've looked at exposure. There's another one where they looked at into brain tissue as well as into the stomach, the other critical organs of the bees, and that's all on our website, wildlifeandwireless.org, by the way. But how these scientists end with this study, which was submitted to the FCC, this could lead to changes in insect behavior, physiology, and morphology over time. And again, 5G is using frequencies low and mid band, but also these high bands. And in fact, more and more technology is coming out using these higher bands with no consideration of the impacts to our insects. There's studies showing injury to trees. There's a 216 study that followed dozens of trees in two German cities over 9 years. They measured the radiation on the different sides of the trees. They looked at where the nearest or the base station antennas were and found that the majority of trees that were in the main beam showed significant damage from the cell phone mast radiation. They state statistical analysis demonstrated that electromagnetic radiation from mobile phone masts is harmful for trees. And there are a lot of images in these reports, and the authors have published several reports that go along that have pictures showing like the antennas and then the damage to that tree canopy right in the line of the main beam. And here's another image of the same tree over time. They tracked trees over many years, 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016. You can see the thinning to the tree, and ultimately it was felled. And yet this is a fake tree, all of these fake trees that are being built with antennas. They are not even trees. What insanity we have going on right now. Now, I wanted to make a note about India. India looked at the science on impacts to trees, birds, bees. They had a interministerial report that was put forward in 2012, looking at all of the science. And they found that the vast majority of published literature indicated deleterious effects in various species. And they actually dropped their limits to 10% of ICNIRP. Now, this wasn't based on, it's very important, this wasn't based on what they knew was a safe level, but rather that they should lower it, being that they found all of these studies, and they chose 10% of ICNIRP. So they have more stringent limits. They also made a series of really incredible recommendations in their 2012 report. They recommend that EMFs be recognized as a pollutant with regular auditing of the levels near schools, hospitals, and ecologically sensitive areas, and that there be more protections for flora and fauna in urban areas. Unlike the United States, India, as well as many other governments, actually measures and does compliance and oversight with companies on their cell towers. They found hundreds of installations were out of compliance in India just last year. And every year they actually post their reports. They audit a certain percentage of installations in the country. And this is a massive program, massive program. And yet in the US, we have no such thing. We have never looked at all of the science. We don't measure the environmental levels. We aren't checking that companies are doing what they say they should do. So there are a lot of changes that need to happen here. And we need limits that are based on an ecosystem approach, not just for humans, but also for wildlife, and that consider the interdependent, interconnected relationships of microbiota, plants, and animals. So we need that ecosystem approach. And that's all in the Levitt et al. Public three-part review. The third part of that review is all about the regulatory needs. The limits need to address biological impacts. They also need to address unique exposure characteristics like modulation and pulsation and long-term chronic exposures, and how this radiation is synergistic with other environmental pollutants. Please also go, in addition to ehtrust.org, to wildlife and wireless.org. We have the science, we have how to take action, we have posters, we have all kinds of resources put together on impacts to the environment. And here's some examples of our resources. There's also wireless enviroimpacts.science, which we put together because we wanted the UN Convention on Biological Diversity to address this issue too. And we did that in collaboration with Prevent Cancer Now, Canadians for Safe Technology, and several other groups. Now, how did this all happen? Well, before 1996, the EPA was in development of radiofrequency exposure guidelines. What you're seeing here is actually a slide. It's the slides at the top of the presentation slides on the development of radiofrequency guidelines that the EPA was in process of doing back in 1996. They said at that time, in 1995, actually, I'm sorry, completion of the guidelines in a timely manner remains a priority of this office. Well, guess what? They were completely defunded from this issue. And that's how we ended up where we are. They were looking at limits that would address heating as well as biological effects. But then in 1996, the FCC adopted limits based on industry groups' recommendations that only address heating effects. There's actually research that the US government and many countries have done going back decades. This is a 1965 Ford Motor Company report. And you can look at the contents. You see they looked at impacts to EEG, on sleep, on nervous system, and so forth. And even going back further, there are studies, this is actually from the World Health Organization in 1973 proceedings, but looking at biological effects. But going back further, post-Cold War, and in the Russia and the US government were in a race to study this issue because they were looking at radar and so forth. So there is a long history of science the US government has known for decades. This is the WHO 1973 report that was looking at not just cancer, but all kinds of other issues. There's even a NIOSH, the National Institutes of Occupational, they were looking at this issue of microwave and biological effects. But right now, the NIOSH, the Department of Labor, they have not looked at the issue of occupational exposure at all. It's a real regulatory gap. In fact, we don't even have federal safety standards because when the EPA was defunded and the FCC adopted these limits, that's not called the proper safety standard. Those are guidelines that the FCC adopted, and those are limits that we have, but they're not safety standards proper. And the limits that we have do not protect against the biological impacts. How did we get here? Just go to the Harvard report, Captured Agency, to learn about that. A few years old now, but still very relevant. That report talks about how the wireless industry is acting like the tobacco industry, and how US Congress receives millions of dollars from industry through lobbying and other ways that the companies fund different elected officials. So elected officials are not, wanting to make any changes, being that their position depends on having the support of these companies. The Norm Alster, who's the investigative reporter, this is with the Harvard Center for Ethics, says that wireless companies are using the same playbook as big tobacco, and that the US FCC is a captured agency with a revolving door between industry and government. And here are some examples. You have Meredith Atwell Baker. Currently, she is actually the head of the CTIA, but she used to be she started out, she was with the CTIA, that's the wireless industry. Then she went to the FCC and she was an FCC commissioner. Then she became CEO of the CTIA wireless industry. Same person, but through industry, government, and back to industry. And then, of course, we have FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr, used to be a lawyer for a law firm, Wiley Ryan, that represented the wireless industry in suing San Francisco for its cell phone right to know ordinance. And now he's been an FCC commissioner since 2017. He professes the safety of 5G and cell phone radiation whenever asked publicly. We have that on our website. Then you have former FCC chair Tom Wheeler, who used to be the head of the wireless industry. Then he was appointed FCC chairman. Now he is the CEO of a group and he works on telecommunications. We have and by the way, Tom Wheeler set the stage for where we are now in terms of 5G, opening up and fast tracking. He set the stage for that in many actions at the FCC. And now, and then came Ajit Pai, who's not with us anymore, but then under Ajit Pai, former FCC chair, he put forward streamlining on 5G with fast tracked it across the country. Well, he also used to be a lawyer for Verizon Wireless. And then he became FCC commissioner, and now he's back working with firms on telecommunications. So it's that revolving door. This revolving door is not just in the US. It is an international reality. We have Thomas Barmuller, pardon me if I misspell his name, used to be at the Austrian Federal Parliament, then became managing director of the Austrian Wireless Industry Association. And now he's director of the Mobile and Wireless Forum for Europe, Middle East, and Africa. We have Robert Giz, and again, spelling, Premier of the Atlantic Prince Edward Island. So working in government, and now he's president and CEO of the Canadian Wireless Telecom Association. We have Vittorio Colau, who was the CEO of Vodafone, on the board of directors of Vodafone and Verizon, and then became Italy's Minister for Technological Innovation and Digital Transformation. And here you see him in 2023 in the Verizon board. This just goes on and on and on and on and on and on. Cell tower radiation is an environmental exposure in need of federal accountability. There is no agency with activity researching the issues of the health and environmental effects of cell towers or 4G and 5G small cell antennas in the federal government at all. There is no agency with health expertise looking at that. That is why there are many communities with large setbacks for wireless antennas. So if you're listening, please find out what's the ordinance in your community. And there are communities with 1,500, 1,500, 250-foot setbacks, even 100-foot setbacks, which are better than what we have in some communities like New York and DC, where you have it 10 feet, right? So find out what your ordinance is, see what you can do. You may be in a state and a community where you can have a say where towers are sited. There are 16 community boards in New York, for example, that have passed moratoriums or letters of disapproval, and they are working hard to stop the continued proliferation of these horrific 5G towers. We have such a regulatory gap also because there's no compliance or enforcement program for cell towers or 5G, 4G small cells in the US at all, no oversight, and it needs to be addressed. There's no checking on what the levels are. There's no measuring, monitoring, or mapping for environmental levels, and yet many countries actually map and monitor. Here's Greece. Every little triangle here shows where they measure what is the radiation at that site. They have 500 fixed sites in the country, 13 mobile stations that drive around to see what the levels are. And yet, the US has none of this. The US also doesn't have a database online where you can see where all the cell towers are in the country. This is a map from Switzerland. Now it's you can go pull out also, and they have a listing of every site in the country. If you're in the US, we don't have that. There is no map you can go to see all the wireless facilities, 5G, 4G, cell towers. It doesn't exist. The FCC doesn't gather all that data. And this is a real issue. There's no federal registry of all wireless sites. Actually, let's review this. So, how can the government rely on the FCC to protect the public and the environment with these regulatory gaps? We have no enforcement program, no standardized data-backed compliance procedures, no measuring and monitoring, no federal registry, no health or environmental surveillance, no ongoing research on bioeffects, and no regular evaluation of FCC limits. The New Hampshire Commission on 5G is a place to start if you're trying to make a change. They looked at the science, they looked at the policy issues, and they came up with 15 recommendations to protect the public. This is a very important report. They talked about measures to reduce wireless exposure to the public that elected officials can begin to promote. They talked about raising awareness with a statewide educational multimedia campaign. And they also have recommendations to address the lack of accountability in the federal government. They say we need limits that protect the environment for ecologically sensitive areas. We need limits that address children's vulnerability and so forth. They also recommend that wireless antennas be set back at 1,600 feet from schools and homes, and that there should be measuring and monitoring. Most people aren't aware that there are bans and restrictions on Wi-Fi in schools in many countries. And it depends on the country as to what those are, like Belgium and France, Cyprus and Israel, French Polynesia, no Wi-Fi in the kindergarten. Those access points are not allowed. They're not allowed to have Wi-Fi devices. That's because of the radiation. The New Hampshire Commission recommends that replacing the Wi-Fi with Ethernet and safer technology that does not emit radio frequency radiation. Here is a simple thing that I do. And my computer is connected this way. This is, in fact, my computer that I took a picture of. I have an Ethernet cord attached to an Ethernet adapter, and then that's how I get the internet. The Wi-Fi is turned off on my computer. Schools can do this. It can be done. It needs to be done. Do this in your office. Go to our Healthy Tech at Home project website in order to learn how to do this. It's so much easier than you think. Here's a picture from a friend's son came over, and let's not talk about the addiction to Minecraft, but nonetheless, he needed to play his Minecraft as we talked about cell phone radiation, and we hooked it up, as she does in her home, with this adapter. You can use a tablet on an Ethernet. The Ethernet connects, you got the adapter, the Wi-Fi is turned off, but this child was playing this game, which I don't necessarily recommend, but nonetheless, it's a hard world we parents of young children are in. The Archbishop Makarios Hospital in Cyprus removed Wi-Fi from the pediatric and neonatal units to protect the kids. They even have a whole multimedia campaign, as I talked about. This is an image from French Polynesia, where they inform the public about how all of these devices emit radiation in a home. They have a whole 30-second video that actually covers a lot of spaces. So there's so much to learn about this issue. Companies can fix this. They can bring tech to market with hardware and software changes to reduce and eliminate our electromagnetic radiation exposures. They can do this, but we, the people, need to pressure them. We need to use our pocketbooks, the power of the pocketbook. Networks can be designed to prioritize wired to and through homes, not just everything wireless, and that can reduce the need for increasing wireless infrastructure. Please learn more at ehtrust.org, and I thank you so much. I know I have just a few minutes more, and I wanted to show you something, which is some of the old documents from the U.S. government. This is the last time the EPA looked at the issue. This is a report on the biological effects of EMS. And as you can see, it's dated 1984 because that was the last time they reviewed the issue. And there are papers going back for decades showing there's been a lot of look at this, and the funding's all dried up in the US government. This was one of the compendiums that the US government used to have final reports on all the science quarterly that was done. This is for the Aerospace Medical Division, Brooks Air Force Base, Texas. And I have tons of these from Zori Glazier. Magda Havas has a website with all of this information as well. And yet we just stopped. We stopped looking at this. This is US Department of Energy looking at the biological effects of electromagnetic fields. This is from the US Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, talking about the electromagnetic fields and biology. These reports exist. They have been ignored. Funding has ceased. Here's another one, US Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, talking about this is the notes from a symposium on the biological effects of EMS. It goes on and on and on. And now the US government is stating, the National Toxicology Program, NIH, is saying they no longer have to study this issue. They're not going to be studying this issue, and they actually stopped their research that they were doing on biological impacts after finding clear evidence of cancer. I'll be on the panel tomorrow night and glad to talk more about this again. ehtrust.org and Healthy Tech Home. We have several web pages, but if you go to ehtrust.org, you can learn more about this issue. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Theodora. That was a very thorough presentation. So really appreciate all the information that you shared. So you have about a minute left. So just real quickly, just to end on a positive note, and within a minute, is there anything optimistic that you see happening in the United States that gives you hope for the future with regard to this issue?
100%. The New Hampshire Commission report has had a reverberation effect all across the country. There are communities all over working on this issue. I talked about the Temecula School Board ban on cell towers at schools. There are many school communities now working on getting bans for cell towers near schools. This is happening. If you are interested in this issue, find out if you have a state or local group and get involved. There are bills, several bills moving forward on smart meters, on cell towers near schools. Get involved in your community. People are really having an impact. And then there are also communities working at the federal level. So connect with us. We have action on educating federal officials and trying to stop all of these fast track bills that US Congress actually has. So there's a lot happening, and also in many other countries where they are working hard. They're way ahead of us, still have a long way to go. But yes, a lot is happening. Get involved. Everything you do makes a difference. Many hands make light work.
Thank you so much. And for those that wish they could have asked questions today, Theodora will be on the panel. I believe it's the second panel tomorrow night, so Saturday. Is that correct? Is it the second panel?
I don't know the timing. It's like 8.
So check our schedule. All right, so maybe 8:15 tomorrow is the second panel, but double check the schedule on The Real Truth About Health. If you want to ask questions, there should be a little time during that panel to ask Theodora some questions. So thank you so much for all the amazing information that you shared. If we could unmute the audience so they can share their appreciation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it. Thanks. Keep up